Is it really just me, or does this world seem very bland? Strangely enough, I haven't found any people. I never noticed it when I lived on Earth's orbit because, well, it's an orbit. But this is a city area, you expect some people to be alive. An unfortunate result for you, since everybody fled this city since I was born. Oh good, a person. And who might you be? Then this encounter must have meant we were destined to meet by fate. To clarify that information you want to be processed, my name is Cammy Cornwall. Cammy Cornwall? Wait, so I have a twin sister? Expected for you to arrive at that immediate assumption. You are wrong. I am not your sister. I'm actually gendered of the male sex, but my parents wanted a girl rather than a boy, and I inevitably ended up forced upon my parents to live as a lady. Glad my parents never did that to me. So by under all this means you are a multiverse counterpart of me. As quickly you think to be correct from a Campbell. You're wrong. I'm an idiot. Do not dishonor yourself like that, you fool! At any rate, what business have you inside my dimension past the borders? Well, I recently rebranded my YouTube channel, and ever since then this city has been my backdrop with this badass looking avatar. I comprehend. I will leave you be and take my leave. I need to attend my daily recon across this wasteland of a city. Well, okay. Good luck to you. As do you. My personal experience of 2022 can be summarized as this. An absolute mess. Constant stress, sleep deprivation, consistent procrastinations, internal assessments, and since it was my final year in school grounds, I was still under consideration on what I wanted to do before I leave, and getting everything ready when moving on to adulthood. And that's not even getting into the games which, to me, 2022 had to be the worst year for my gaming experience. But I'll get into why when I make the worst games list. But despite that, I've still played a good variety of games for the first time this year. Not as better as the last 2 years, but for the amount of bad that I played, I've still played an amount of good. I really wish I could have made a list of my favorite games of 2022, but to be perfectly honest, I barely played any games released during the year, so yeah, not doing that. I'm only going to include one game per franchise because 1 or 2 franchises may or may not take over the entire list. And also, if I played the original version of the game prior, but have played an enhanced version of the game with some minor alterations, but also some huge changes, I sadly can't count those. So my apologies, Doki Doki Literature Club Plus. I love you in your beautiful world, but you're an enhanced version of a game that already made number 2 on my Games of 2021 list. What makes the first game not completely age? Well, you could say it's graphics or voice acting or the actual control of the game, but more often than not, first game syndrome is pretty common in almost every franchise you come across. No surprise there, but they needed to start somewhere and figure out what they wanted to do and to handle the franchise afterwards. It's also no surprise that most later entries tend to make the first game not a kind of a game that people will want to replay. Heck, it makes it really hard for me to replay Ratchet 1 with its lack of strafing and switching weapons being done in real time. And yet, for some reason, I can't find the most noticeable ways as to what makes Sly Cooper and Amphibious Raccoon as one of those cases of first game syndrome. Compared to later games in the trilogy, well, I haven't touched Sly 3 yet, but I'm still getting around to that, and Sly 2 is a game that people tend to believe as the best in the series, and yet I find it a game with a lot of flaws in both gameplay and story, while with Sly 1, I find it not too bad for a first game. Okay, admittedly, there are things that have been changed in later entries that I'm glad that are changed, such as having a health bar and infinite lives, with having a life system and no health bar in Sly 1 is a pain. Each episode is the same objective each time. You travel across the level and get to the main hub world, and then you enter through places to get to the missions to obtain treasure keys in every one to unlock the boss room. Most of the missions are pretty simplistic, but do take advantage of the stealth quite magnificently, and certain missions will have gameplay variety to spice up the fun. Without having to overcomplicate things with plot twists and all that, the game just tells a simple and decently made story, going double for the trio of the Sly Cooper gang being entertaining as hell, and of course the Fiendish 5 with props going to characters like Mugshot, the Panda King, and especially Clockwork. Seriously though, villains may not be the high points of the series, it's easily one of its low points, but Clockwork, best villain. Take notes, Neela. With the success of Grand Theft Auto during my PS2 days, major controversies aside, it's really hard to deny how these games impacted people's childhoods. And it really makes sense that due to its phenomenal success, other companies tried their own takes on GTA-styled sandbox games. In 2006, Rockstar finally had competition when THQ released Saints Row for the Xbox 360, and this was the rivalry of the time during the 7th generation of gaming. Saints Row 1 and 2 were and still are masterpieces of what early 7th gen sandbox games are capable of. But at the same time, they never really had too much of an identity to themselves. They just felt like wackier versions of the PS2 GTA trilogy. And so for the third entry in the series, THQ decided to make a change altogether with more carnage, more emphasis on comedy, and all around an absolutely hilarious funky jam. Love or hate the tone that the series decided to go for from then onward, it's really hard to deny that Saints Row the Third caused a huge impact on the entire franchise as a whole. You still travel around the city to do your mission objectives, but it really never takes away the fun that you have. Once you activate a mission, it does become more linear, but still, I find it better to actually have help find your way around than just finding out which road am I supposed to turn on. You pick up more people as you progress to expand your gang to take down Killbane, the DeWinter sisters, and the rest of a syndicate composed of the Morningstar, Decker, and the Luchador gangs. It just feels like a dream come true, and that goes double for the action. It's pretty fluid, and you get multiple options for what you want to do, like shooting them down or kicking them in the nuts to lower their guards. This game isn't perfect by any means, especially when you get to talking about how weaker guns can be compared to GTA, but all around was an incredible fun time, and I'm glad I chose this as the very first game I played in 2022. Staying up past midnight to exceed expectations is a memory that never ceases to amaze me. Prologue stories sure are something, aren't they? In order to expand the lore of the world, or heck just simply learning about a specific character, prologues are one good way of emphasizing story and learning about how these specific characters came to be who they are now or what they are. Heck, some of the best games in certain series are prologues. Not all of them stuck the landing, but you could say that they at least tried, which is something I believe in a certain kid who could feel without having a heart. Thing is though, I mentioned 358 Days Over 2 in my Games of 2021 list, but what I mentioned though is that the 358 Days Over 2 in the 1.5 HD Remix collection is just a cutscene collection upgraded into the graphical style of Kingdom Hearts 2, with full-on voice acting, and as a collection of cutscenes, it's such a good watch, and the actor's phenomenal voicing made me cry towards the end, but in the end, we never really got a game of 358 Days Over 2 for modern consoles, and I think it would be difficult to do so with the dual screen of the DS. But depending on who you ask, the gameplay itself is probably the most divisive thing imaginable in the franchise, focusing on mission-based gameplay so you're limited on where you have to go for that specific mission, as well as different types of missions like kill this enemy, investigate this area, or make a turkey sandwich for Zigbar. That last one I made up. But I could really go for a chicken sandwich right about now. But I don't hate this type of gameplay. It definitely has room for improvement, but with the limitations for the DS, I'd say it gets the job done. Combat isn't too bad in itself either. You have panels for a different move pool, and the more you progress, the more panels you unlock for upgrading stuff like HP, magic, etc. And I've already mentioned how good the story is, but without just Roxas's narrative speaking over his time with each member of the organization, we actually get to see for ourselves how each one treats Roxas during his missions. Some people like Larxene and Vexen treat him as trash and inferior, but others like Demyx and Luxor treat him with respect. And that's not even getting into the friendship he shares with Axel and Xion, which if you played the game, you know how depressing and soul-crushing things get towards the end. But in Kingdom Hearts Prologue fashion with 3 new characters, that's to be expected every time. One thing that I love about doing these kinds of lists is finding a game that you may have never even heard about until a specific YouTuber talked about it. That game ended up on my radar for quite some time when a reviewer and countdown maker called Benjamage talked about a bite-sized indie 3D platformer called Tori 3D made by Ciactro. I mean, the game is less than $2 on my Switch eShop, and yet for some reason, I never got to play it until later on in the year. And I enjoyed every second of it. This was a last minute decision, and now you know why this is a top 16 rather than a top 15. Tori 3D takes the essence and feel of a PS1 game in terms of graphical style, and it makes the game look very visually pleasing. The game has got 4 different settings with 2 for each. You got your rooftop levels, ocean levels, ice levels, and highway levels. The game looks easy, but come to the final level and you really start having to put your skills to the test. Games made by Ciactro also contain some creepy-like areas like stars with faces. The music itself is also pretty chilling and catchy, which fits right well into the atmosphere as well. The game also doesn't take too long to beat. Hell, it takes less than an hour to beat it. But the hour is all worth it, and with the Sonic Adventure 2-like ranking system for the levels, allows a bunch of replayability to S-rank all the levels. Sorry if this segment is shorter than you wanted it to be, but hey, it fits this game's length pretty well. Thank you, Ben, for introducing me to Ciactro's games, and now I have the sequel, MacBat 64, Beanie, and Super Kiwi 64 as well. With a mass amount of a video game collection to play, whether it be both physically or digitally, you've played a game that, at the beginning, you'd be playing it like every day of the week. But then over time, you start to lose that addiction and just drift away because you lose motivation to continue playing. Like, you'll still play it from time to time, but not as much as you once did. And after a couple weeks when Season 8's released, I barely had any motivation to go back to Fall Guys the last few months. Maybe I should play Bury the Light on Spotify to regain that motivation. Considering the crap ton of games I first played this year, as well as the amount of games that I've replayed, it's impossible for me to make a schedule for my games, considering everything else I've got in my life going on. And it's probably going to get even busier. So I've had my reason why I couldn't go back to Fall Guys recently, but considering I made a countdown dedicated to my favorite and least favorite minigames back when Season 7 was released, you can tell how invested I was with this game, and granted, while I still think Seasons 8 and 9 are good as well, Season 7 was the peak of the game for me, which is why the game is lower on the list than I'd wish it be. But filled to the brim with so much varietal and fun minigames from races, survival modes, team and hunt minigames, and so much more. Each of them provide ways to beat your opponents and get better at every minigame each time, as well as some snarky tactics and strategies to become one cheeky bastard to the other competitors, just so that you can come out on top and take the crown home. Playing with friends and playing all the different game modes, whether you want to play by yourself or in a team, keep playing until you get as many wins as you can and give the competitors a taste of your ultimate knockout. In some games letting you do whatever the f you want, morality systems are game gimmicks I welcome into any game. Having an option to become a good guy or a bad guy gets really clever and upholds a full-on true reason to replay a game. Every single choice that you make in these games seriously matters. Not only will the story perspective and you will change, but more often than not, how NPCs tend to treat you, the status of the entire world, and also how the important characters see you if you decide to walk down the path that you, the player, chose to go down. Sucker Punch's infamous series is all about that morality system. Thanks to a classmate, I managed to play through both Infamous 1 and 2. I played Infamous 1 in 2021 and didn't play Infamous 2 until 2022, and I feel like the sequel improves in a lot of ways. Empire City was very fun to travel around in the first game, but I became more invested when traveling around New Marias. Much like the first game, the problem I have with the game is when you do missions in another area later on in the game. I'm looking directly at you and your wife, Bloodtown. Every time you unlock more abilities and fight a cluster truck group of enemies with all these different skills and techniques, as well as all the enemies attacking you too with their powers, make you wonder how the frick my PS3 hasn't burned out. And I used this thing for 10 stinking years. frame drops are super consistent during these particular fights, when not to mention the controller vibrating every hit, every frame drop, every second. Jesus mate, I'm not freaking horny enough for you to be my goddamn vibrator. But the combat is very fluid and well thought out. Story-wise, it's pretty interesting about the whole conflict between the beast destroying Empire City and charging up the RFI to kill him. With the Hero and Dark missions, new characters Quo and Nyx will tell you what you can do. Granted, aside from what you choose in the final mission, from a dialogue perspective in the main story doesn't change how they truly feel about Cole and Zeke. But I feel like both Quo and Nyx are well-written characters in their own way. Really a way to end off Cole's development and his saga of the series to let the new guy and infamous second son take the leading role. I consistently never stop doing Game of the Year lists, and I literally mean that I work on it basically almost 24/7. Every time I play a new game of the year, I need to put them down as to how I would rank them, and possibly change the ordering if my opinions have changed either just slightly or not. And if you play more than 20 or so games you've never played before, it's always good to memorize them. Like, I actually forgot Asphalt 9 Legends in my top 58 games I played in 2020 list, which was meant to be a top 59. But then you look at how many games you played and come to a sense of nostalgia as to how the list begins. The first games that you first played in a year are the setting stones as to how the gaming year will end up becoming. And I can't help but feel nostalgic for playing these games despite it being less than a year. It could be no wonder why Shin Megami Tensei Digital Devil Saga ended up being the way it is, since the strangest thing is that it's a PlayStation 2 game, but I never played it before up until early January of 2022, and playing it later on in the year, continuing it on, you said Sabola Chicken Nostalgia Noodle Soup, and yet for some reason, I find more fun out of this than in SMT Nocturne. It's a great game, but it's commonly known as the hardest game in all the Megaten games, and the level up move pool fell off to me. Digital Devil Saga will still kick your ass hard, but it's nowhere near as brutal. Instead of talking to demons and convincing them to join your party, you are the demons. You can unlock a move where enough damage is taken off the rest of the demon, you can feed on mere Atma points to level up faster, and there's an entire skill tree dedicated to unlocking brand new and better moves. I will say that normally I praise stories way too much for my liking, but Digital Devil Saga has just a fine plot with some dialogue that aged like expired milk.
I do not comprehend. 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 I do not comprehend.
Do not comprehend.
You shut the fuck up! You shut the fuck up!
It may seem like I'm criticizing this game a bit too much, but compared to the games before, it brings me a sense of not only isolation, but also hope. The characters, while strange, don't show their emotions and are oblivious as to what they are, since the sequel answers that question at the beginning of the game, and given to what the story is, it does bring a good enough message to immerse the player into the sequel. Even if you didn't like the first game, you're definitely bound to get a lot out of Digital Devil Saga 2. I know Suda51, you know Suda51, we all know Suda51. Creator of games like Killer 7, Lollipop Chainsaw, Shadows of the Damned, and especially with his most popular games, the No More Heroes series. If you've been watching countdowns throughout the past 10 or 13 years or so, you would know of both No More Heroes 1 and 2, especially with the recent re-releases on both PC and Nintendo Switch as to capitalize on the announcement of No More Heroes 3. And while both games are fantastic in their own ways and style, for some reason I enjoy having unsatisfying revenge. By no means is No More Heroes 2 a perfect game. In fact, it is more flawed than the first game. 1/4 of the boss lineup is either mediocre or just an absolute train wreck, and despite the game teasing 52 bosses, you fight 25 of them in a combined mech. The Battle Royale kills a lot of them by Dr. Let's Shake, and Mr. Sir Henry motherfucker steals 3 kills in the top 10. And speaking of Henry, he is so much fun to play as, swift and fun to control. The problem? You play as him for one good boss fight that takes 3 to 5 minutes, while you start playing as the taunting Shinobu for 2 levels and 2 boss fights. I mean, the story about Shinobu's gameplay is already birds of a ground at this point. And the story, like in a previous countdown I said, is good but has noticeable flaws. The way of how the message is told is fantastic and gives Travis a surprisingly amount of development, but it's still a generic revenge story, and I felt like Travis going after the final boss anyways just ruins his development. and since the final boss plays as unsatisfying revenge, at least it's been rumored anyway, that just makes it all the more ridiculous. But the rest of the game is still pretty amazing. The music is godlike. I really do like the pixel art for the jobs that you do around Sansa Destroy. Some of the bosses like Alice and Margaret are some of the best bosses I've ever faced in a hack and slash. Not having to pay for the ranked fights since jobs are optional. Combat feels more my style, and I still like the story in spite of it all. I mean, it's the magic of Suda 51. Can't go wrong with that gem of a mindset Batman has. I'm not saying that the series is perfect, but holy hell have Mega Man X games fallen after X4. That's not to say that the previous games have been perfect either. I didn't like X2 and I question my opinions on X3, but X5 to X7 have been absolutely some of the worst I played in the entire Mega Man franchise. After the abominations of Mega Man X6 and X7, I went into X8 incredibly skeptical, but by the time I finished X7, I wanted to take a little break. But I just went into Mega Man X8 anyways, and right from the opening level, I fell in love with this game instantly. And yet, it's my favorite game in the series to date. And no, I'm not saying that like I did with X3. I genuinely have better reasons as to why I actually like it as my favorite. First off, it fixes the issues that people have with X7, such as how the characters play. Axel is my personal favorite for hovering in mid-air, shooting at enemies in any direction you want. Heck, not only did the gameplay and characters dramatically improve, but also the voice acting has improved drastically from X7. It's pretty outstanding.
I'll take care of it. I can handle this, X. I'll get you to make me into a hunter yet.
Huh, piece of cake. Snag a sample from that Maverick too.
The game is a 2.5D game, keeping the 3D-ness from X7, but keep it in a 2D plane while adding 3D elements to enhance the experience. Hell, one of my favorite new features is not only Alia's return with a sexy new hairstyle, but also 2 new navigators under the names of Layer and Palette. You could choose which navigator you want while playing through the level. Palette hinting at secret areas, Layer uncovering boss weaknesses, and Alia just still having general assistance. Heck, there are even secret unlockable characters. Yes, you can play as the navigators in this game. That's super sweet. Another feature that I love is removing the rescuable Reploid system, which I thought was fundamentally flawed in the previous games, and replacing it with medals in the R&D lab. Medals are currency that you get from defeating enemies and bosses, and the R&D lab serves as a shop to upgrade the characters, buy consumables, unlock extra moves, and develop chips. I will say that as much as I like the story, it gets very confusing at certain points. Not as much as other games such as BlazBlue and Kingdom Hearts, but it's still pretty confusing regardless. Also, I legitimately thought that Lumine was a female. Why does that assumption always flow through my head? Especially since I originally thought Falco Lombardi was female too. I mean, first Falco's eyelashes and now Lumine's hair. I really need to stop assuming this kind of crap. Given the overall history of licensed games, they are infamous for being cheap cash-ins, taking in the style of how they would work. We especially got a crap ton of crappy licensed shovelware with games such as iCarly, E.T., and Aladdin Magic Racer. Right. Despite the reputation, there have been pretty great licensed games, with some being some of the best that the media has presented. DC and Marvel usually excel at providing pretty good licensed games. Not as much as Fantastic Comics or movies, but they have made pretty good video games, such as the Batman Arkham games and a lot of the Spider-Man games. I think it's no surprise that Peter Parker is one of the most iconic characters, especially with his popularity exceeding thanks to Tom Holland in the MCU. The success of Spider-Man No Way Home is astounding, especially when it combines that with the multiversal versions of Peter, such as the iconic Tobey Maguire from Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, and especially Andrew Garfield from The Amazing Spider-Man. The movies may not have done pretty good, especially with The Amazing Spider-Man 2 video game bombing big time, but take a step back and the first Amazing Spider-Man game is a well thought out and constructed game that has elements in it that will be later be an Insomniac Spider-Man game. Nowhere near isn't as popular as some of Spider-Man's other games, but The Amazing Spider-Man brings out a pretty good plot with intuitive level design and awesome Batman Arkham style combat. the game introduces an ability called Web Rush, a move that slows down time by holding a button. Basically, you can also use the Web Rush mechanic to subdue enemies by webbing them and pick up objects to throw at them. I really love how it doesn't slap elements from a movie and instead taking place months after the first movie. Yep, this game is canon to the movies. And when the tension builds up with Petey's friendly neighborhood not so friendly with all the chaos happening, you look back at all that you've done even when you lose all your abilities. Web slinging and climbing buildings is super addictive, finding collectibles and all the different side missions such as stopping crimes and gunfights, and transporting infected civilians to quarantine camps. I did think at the beginning of the year that I called this game my favorite game I played in 2022, but man, times have changed. It is still a great game, however, and if you like the movie, the other Spider-Man games, heck, Spider-Man in general, you may like this game. Part of me makes me realize that I really should stop taking breaks from certain games and actually try to finish them. I mentioned this once before with Okami, but other than the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, I've had Final Fantasy VIII at the end of 2019, and Final Fantasy VII in 2020, and I am still a long way away from completing them, as well as other games I've started a long time ago when I was just a small child. I never even cared for the story in Skate 3, maybe because my young mind didn't even know that there was a story since I was too busy performing flips and ollies at skate parks. There have been loads of times where my mind was like, I need to finish this, but am I really in the mood? When the timing's right, I will go back to the game and try to finish it, only for some ungodly reason to take another month-long break. That kinda happened to me a couple times with Tales of Graces, though not as bad since I have almost finished the game at the time I'm writing this. While not as recognizable as games such as Symphonia and Vesperia, Graces still has a lot of charm to it. One could say that Graces is very gracious. For one, I really love the combat of the game, where its main gimmick is the Elf Break. Filling up a bar will allow an infinite amount of strikes and ups the ante of the fight a lot more. The cool thing about Elf is that it is the source of life in the world of Afinia, sourced inside monuments called the Valkanus Creus to supply the world with Elf energy. And that's the story of the game. Each of the countries are each supplied with their own Valkanus Creus, and making a wind door attempts to suck out the Elf from all of the monuments. And there's another world above Afinia called Fodra, a technological advanced world that unfortunately had all of its Elf dried up, turning the planet into a dried up dead land. I find the story pretty charming with stakes being pushed up high. Tales games are really great at world building, and Graces is definitely no different. I also find the music very charming as well. It is definitely one of my favorite OSTs in the entire series, fitting the countries and the lands and scenarios pretty darn well. Graces also has such an underrated cast, with some of my favorites going as Sophie, Sharia, Pascal, and Malik. My only regret of this game is, again, by the time I'm writing this, I haven't finished it yet. But trust me, I will get around to it. Whenever my instincts decide... Remember the time Telltale Games shut down? Yeah, big bummer, I'll tell you what. But look at them now! They resuscitated and are currently working on some big major projects like the long-awaited Wolf Among Us 2. Telltale Games were, and still are, the dominant kings of storytelling interactive games such as Sam & Max, The Wolf Among Us, and of course The Walking Dead. Season 1 of The Walking Dead game may have aged poorly in terms of animation and engine, but even by normal standards today, it tells a very heartwarming and heartbreaking story, with characters that sound and look very realistic out the wazoo, and you may never know who is going to die or betray you. Lee and Clementine's journey is an unforgettable one, the relationship between two strangers who met at the beginning of the apocalypse, forming a father-daughter-like relationship. And when Lee's journey has ended, it moved Clementine into the second chapter of her apocalypse life. I love Season 1, but unfortunately my PS3 keeps crashing every time I play chapters 2 to 5. I downloaded them, but for some reason I can't play them. So until then, Season 2 is my favorite in the series. By no means is it a perfect season, and while story-wise, it's a downgrade, especially because of how everybody expects Clementine to do all the dirty work for them, since she shouldn't have had to do a lot of these things, but that doesn't mean that they treat her like an object. Luke is definitely the coolest and most realistic guy of the group, keeping it with life and sunshine even in the toughest of times, and keeping the group from tearing apart. And he's definitely up there with Lee, Clementine, and Kenny as my favorite characters. Heck, Kenny returns in this game, which is a big major plus if I say so myself. Florida all the way, mate. But I will say this, not all the characters are highlights. Bonnie's a snake, and Nick is a dick at certain points in the story, and Jane literally provoked Kenny by faking a baby's death and having Clementine kill him just to prove a point. Heck, parts of the story are just as, if not even sadder than in Season 1. Omid's death during the literal first 10 minutes of the game, the silence and intensement between the group after Luke's death causing them to separate, the moment between Lee and young Clementine making people have speculations and their own little game theories if all the events of Season 2 and after were all a dream. Season 2 is no means a masterpiece, but no matter how many times I replay this game, I still bawl my eyes out every time, and people say that video games are only entertainment or a waste of time. 2022 was such a year for gaming. We had some disappointments like Gotham Knights, the Callisto Protocol, and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, and with the bad games of Overwatch 2 and Diablo Immortal made me lost all faith in Activision and Blizzard, but even still, 2022 has been a good year with great releases of Stray, Elden Ring, and God of War Ragnarok. And it's also been a good year for Sega. 2022 has been the best year they've had for the Blue Blur. The Sonic 2 movie is a cinema success. Sonic Prime is a pretty good Netflix original despite the behind the scenes turmoil of Sonic Origins. It still ended up being a pretty good collection of the 4 games. And yet, out of all, I was the most surprised for Sonic Frontiers being my most anticipated game of the year. And it didn't disappoint in the slightest, and after playing the game again made me love the game more, putting this game in the top 5 Sonic game category for me rather than on number 8. The meta era is officially dead, rising to the new era of Sonic, which I call the Renaissance era. Now then, considering my next video will be my Sonic Frontiers review, I'm going to try to keep this brief. Traveling around the open zone islands is such a treat, and there's so much to do, such as fighting guardians and enemies, collecting memory tokens in Coco, the challenges to reveal more of the map and reveal railings, platforms and such, upgrading your stats, doing the story, going through cyberspace levels to obtain vault keys, and simply just exploring around the massive islands. The combat is definitely pretty smooth and well thought out. Chaining combos together make you feel like you're playing Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, accounting into the Titan fights making it Metal Gear Rising Revengeance status of boss fights in not just insanity, but also the music. Heck, Undefeatable is my new intro theme for a reason, and with the music also going through lots of genres like EDM, lo-fi, sereneness, and heavy metal, it definitely tops Sonic 06 for me as my favorite soundtrack in the series. Plus, while still not perfect, the story is definitely a more take on a serious plot written by Ian Flynn, with callbacks to previous characters and events from previous games too, such as Dark Gaia, Tikal, Infinite, Styx, and Tangle. And it goes double for the voice acting, with the cast going for deeper tones. The game is pretty unfinished in certain areas like camera angles and especially the poppin' being issues. Frontiers is a great game. In my hands I hold the ones I love, and I'm walking through the cold dawn always to new horizons. What's pretty surprising is that every single game of the year list I've done from 2020 to 2021 had a Persona game at number 1. Persona 3 Fizz being my favorite game of 2020, and Vanilla Persona 5 and Persona 4 Golden being tied as my favorite game of 2021. And I did say that all 3 of those games were tied as my second favorite game. Past tense being the key word were. After replaying each game with more of an open mind, made me realize that all of these are still in my top 10 favorite games, but each one I have a different experience with. Persona 3 Fizz being my favorite of a bunch, Persona 5 in second, and Persona 4 Golden in third. What's even more surprising is that a Persona game did not make number 1 on this year's list. And it's such a shame too, because Persona 5 Strikers is far more than a spin-off. You could say that I've broken the one game per franchise rule since Persona is a spin-off of the Shin Megami Tensei series, but it all depends on who you ask that believes if it is still a part of the SMT series or not. In my eyes, ever since Persona 4 Golden, all the most recent games of the Persona series since then and nowadays have not used the SMT labels in the official title names. And heck, Persona itself has gotten spin-offs itself. That goes to say, I think that the series has moved on from spin-off to a main franchise. Persona 5 Strikers to me is more than a spin-off since it is a direct sequel to one of the most viral role-playing games in modern gaming. When Dynasty Warriors first came out, it was a staple upon hack and slashes. Able to cut down hundreds of enemies at once with multiple different tactics is a flashy and unbelievable way. And then comes Sengoku Basara, Samurai Warriors, Warriors Orochi, Hyrule Warriors, Fire Emblem Warriors. There are so many Warriors games that thanks to Dynasty Warriors, Musou games became their own franchise. And heck, some people are wondering what other franchises would have their take on a Musou game. And I'm really glad Persona got one. Like Persona 5, something is happening in the metaverse corrupting minds of people forming twisted desires. But instead of palaces, they're called jails, and you must free the desires from the jails. The story, like the first game, is pretty damn good. Inferior to Persona 5's, but I still find it charismatic and dreamy in almost all of the ideas. Heck, it even introduced characters that even became some of my all-time favorites in the series, such as Sophia, Zenkichi, and... One thing I will love this game for over Persona 5's, however, is the bloody soundtrack. Holy freaking crap, does it have a goddamn rock hard ass soundtrack. You definitely got a lot of fantastic remixes, the Bloomy Villain remix being especially my favorite, but then we got Singularity, Anti-Hero, Tower of Life, Jail and Abyss, Counter-Strike, and Daredevil, which is playing right now. Persona has never been flashier with combat. All the tricks you could pull up your sleeve, showtimes, gathering stuff in the jails during the quests, there's just so much fun to have. This is a Persona game we truly don't deserve, but we got it in spectacular fashion.
Making the mother of all omelets here, gang. Can't thread over every egg. Why won't you die? Can't hurt me, Jack. Nanomachine, son.
Do I honestly even have to explain how rad this game is since last video? I made an entire review dedicated to this game alone? Know what? Screw it. I'm gonna do it anyway. Hacking and slashing your way across the levels with heavy and light attacks to give a whole bunch of variety to beat the Cyborg and UG enemies. Counting with finishing off them with blade mode to steal their electrolytes or slice off their limbs. The levels themselves are pretty fun too, since stealth is much more of an option compared to all other games in the series previously, focusing more on action, but you can avoid being spotted and attack enemies without being spotted as well. Counting into the bosses with a lot of fun and completely memorable battles. Well, all except for Sundowner and the pointless mini-bosses of Hammerhead and Crad. But aside from all those, very fun fights that test your might and skills, such as parrying, dodging, and comboing. Oh, and the music is just incredible. My favorite tracks definitely have to go to The Stains of Time, Rules of Nature, and It Has to Be This Way. And the story, while oddly weird, is technically speaking a combination of both Kojima and Platinum Games' sum of their parts, making it really worthwhile, and all in all is a very philosophical plot pointing into the idea of carving your own path and establishing your own directives to come up with your personal ideals as a sense of motivation. All of this is what makes Metal Gear Rising a game to behold, and all this definitely makes this one of my favorite games of all time, and almost made number one, but sadly, one other game sadly took over. Lightning Returns was so close to making it as my favorite game of 2022, as concluding the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy was all the more worth it. Playing both of the Rush games made me realize that Sonic Rush Adventure is the better game of the two, since I fell in love with this game's story and gameplay immediately. No More Heroes is definitely a Suda 51 achievement with its glorious overworld, weirdly good story, but I didn't like a lot of the jobs and most of the levels were uninteresting, long, or boring. Despite its mixed reputation, I will say that I really have a bit of a soft spot for Mega Man X Dive. I just love all of the different ideas put into it, making it my third favorite game in the series. Fight me! Although at the very least a lot of people will agree that Final Fantasy IX is a fantastic game with its story, characters, and while it has outdated graphics, does look better than 7 and 8. Digital Devil Saga 2 is a really great game and does have a lot of stuff that improves from the original, such as OST and story, but I still prefer the first game for odd preferences, but mostly towards strange nostalgia feelings. To be honest, picking my favorite game wasn't much of a challenge, because even despite all of the other action-packed games and fantastic games that are considered to be some of the best of their genre or gaming as a whole, But number 1 is a game that comes from a weird trilogy of games that not a lot of people really like. And yet for some reason, it's my favorite that the series has ever presented in the franchise. And with all that said, let's talk about the second game of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. Ever since I finished Final Fantasy XIII in 2021 made me wait until the day I would play the second game. I can definitely say that while it is still a divided game like the first game, I am not alone in this when I say that 13-2 is better than the first game. And it improves everything that fans have problems with 13. The linear hallway-like structure overworlds have been turned into open areas, perfect for doing the side quests and finding a lot of the collectibles and time gates necessary to go to all the different paradoxes. Oh yeah, the story of Final Fantasy XIII-2 revolves around time travel, and instead of the original cast, the new cast is Lightning's sister Sarah, Mog, and the hunter and last of the humans, Null Christ. And their journey is all about finding lightning and preventing all timelines from being destroyed by Caius. But like the first game, the story is confusing as all hell, but once you get further in the game, you'll tend to understand a lot better. While the battle system is still the same as in the first game, instead you capture monsters to use in your party. And honestly, I really enjoyed fighting the bosses. I didn't find 85% of them tedious or boring, I actually found them fun to fight. Some bosses also require QuickTime event segments to finish them off, but I never found them an issue. Also, did I forget to mention how glorious the soundtrack is? People are mixed on the soundtrack and I can understand why, mainly due to the vocal tracks, but I can't help but enjoy the tracks. Heck, some of the songs were vocalized by the guy who sang the vocal songs in Devil May Cry 3, so that's a 10 out of 10 right there. Looking at all the different places and looking at how they were looking in the different AF timelines make it super astounding. Such as the Sunleft Waterscape and the 300 AF timeline having a massive jungle vibe, but the 400 AF timeline freezes a forest. Lightning Returns is an amazing concluding game to an already amazing trilogy, and was so close to making it on this list. But for me, I prefer Final Fantasy XIII-2 since it really exceeded my expectations. I was not expecting to like this game as much as I do. I really cannot recommend this trilogy to everyone. In fact, it makes it hard to recommend. But the trilogy has always had a special place in my heart. The first game of the trilogy back in 2019 made me fall in love with role-playing games despite my original hatred towards it. And continuing and finishing the journey 3 years later makes me realize how much I really am going to miss these characters in the world of Cocoon, Grand Pulse, and Nova Chrysalis. It's my favorite era of the Final Fantasy series, and it's so influential to me that not even the original 6 or even the PS1 trilogy can match. I'm One Campbell, and so far from the looks of the games I first played in 2023, it's looking to be a pretty decent year. But let's hope to God I don't find a game throughout the rest of the year that is somehow worse than Waifu Impact. Anyways, next countdown, I will be talking about the top 10 worst games I first played in 2022. And until then, see you all next time.